He was yanked out of his seat, accused of being a threat, and dragged to the back of the plane, all because he was an old black man who didn't speak. No one asked his name. No one cared to understand his silence. They just saw his skin, his age, and decided he didn't belong in first class. The crew whispered behind curtains, passengers turned their heads, and every act of humiliation was dressed up as policy. What no one realized, what not a single soul on that flight stopped to consider, was that they had just messed with the wrong man. You're not going to believe who he really is, or what happens when the truth lands with the plane. Think you know how this ends? You don't. Stick around. Watch carefully. And before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? What do you think is really going on here? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe if you're ready for a story that flips everything you thought you knew about power, race, and justice at 35,000 feet. The boarding area buzzed with a typical hum of early check-in, footsteps, boarding calls, and the muted sound of rolling suitcases dragging across the floor. Gate 9A, reserved exclusively for first-class passengers, gleamed with clean tile and air perfumed with subtle vanilla. A tall young flight attendant named Kara stood near the jet bridge entrance, casually scrolling through her smartwatch while greeting passengers with automated cheer. She barely lifted her eyes as an elderly black man stepped into view, ticket in hand. His coat was heavy wool, slightly faded but neatly pressed. His gray fedora, tilted just enough to suggest pride, matched his polished shoes. He walked slowly but with dignity, each step deliberate as if pacing by memory, not weakness. Kara clocked him instantly. Without hesitation, she leaned slightly toward her fellow crew member, Brian, who leaned against the service console, sipping a latte. "Well," Kara whispered, nudging him with her elbow. "Looks like 2A just became 2, Brian smirked. "Someone let him wander in from economy?" Kara tapped her screen and opened a crew-only chat labeled Cabin Chronicles, a long-running group message used for private jokes and sarcastic commentary among the flight crew. With a smirk curling the edge of her lip, she typed, "2A just boarded. Smells like mothballs and 1940. Hope he doesn't bring a gramophone." She added a gif of someone fake gagging, hit send, and tucked the watch back under her sleeve. But almost immediately, her face fell. Her eyes widened. She gasped softly. "Shit." Brian looked over. "What?" She held up her watch. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I sent it to the wrong group. I didn't tap the Chronicles thread. I sent it to Cabin Ops." Brian stopped mid-sip. As in, Kara didn't answer. He knew. Cabin Ops was the operations group that included senior management, flight supervisors, HR, and Olivia Stanton, the CEO's daughter, who was rumored to be flying today. Brian let out a low whistle, eyes shifting. You better pray the Wi-Fi's slow. But it wasn't. Meanwhile, the man in question, Grant Holloway, had already made his way down the jet bridge. He didn't notice the stairs, nor the sudden hush behind the galley curtain. He had taken this walk hundreds of times, on dozens of flights. But that didn't mean he was numb to the atmosphere. Not deaf to the shift in air pressure when someone saw his skin, his age, and his silence, and assumed smallness. He stepped into the cabin and calmly moved toward seat 2A. As he reached for the overhead bin, the passenger seated behind him, a woman in her early 50s, wearing a tailored white blazer and a designer purse clutched tight to her chest, leaned toward the man next to her and whispered just loud enough to carry, "Ugh, that smell. Like wet newspaper and Vicks. First class is going downhill fast." The man chuckled without looking up. Grant's hand paused mid-reach. He heard that. Brian emerged from the galley with a small silver bottle in hand, an in-flight cologne spritzer typically used post-meal. As Grant sat down and folded his coat neatly onto his lap, Brian approached with exaggerated brightness. "Good afternoon, sir. Just a little refresher to brighten the cabin ambience," he said, not waiting for approval. He tilted the bottle and spritzed twice in quick succession, once into the air and once directly at the collar of Grant's coat where it rested on his lap. "Citrus and cedar. Very uplifting," Brian added with a grin, already walking away. The scent lingered, chemical and artificial, layered over wool and memory. Grant sat still. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak, but his fingers closed gently around the lapel of his coat. His eyes, calm and ancient, stared forward like someone listening to an old song no one else could hear. Kara reappeared a few minutes later, her expression taut behind a rehearsed smile. She walked slowly down the aisle with a clipboard in hand, her steps deliberate as she stopped at Grant's row. "Mr. Holloway," she said loudly, as if assuming he was hard of hearing, which he was, but not completely. "Can you understand me, sir?" She exaggerated her words, her tone bordering on mockery, disguised as concern. Grant reached for the small notepad he always kept in his breast pocket, along with a pen. He wrote, slowly but with firm strokes, "Yes, I understand you just fine." Then, he held it up with steady hands. Kara barely glanced at it before turning to the young man seated across the aisle, a white passenger in his late 20s, casually dressed in tech bro fashion, hoodie and wireless earbuds hanging around his neck. "Excuse me, sir," Kara said, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "Would you mind assisting? This gentleman here may need help understanding what we're saying. Perhaps you could interpret." The young man blinked, momentarily confused. "Interpret what?" Kara chuckled stiffly. "He's nonverbal or deaf or both. Just try to help him if he gets confused. All right?" Before the man could answer, Grant tapped the tray table, slowly writing again. "I do not need an interpreter. I am not confused." He flipped the page so it faced her, the ink bold and pointed. Kara's smile faltered, but she quickly turned away, muttering something under her breath as she moved back toward the galley. The young man across the aisle gave Grant a small nod, half apologetic, half embarrassed, before glancing down at his phone to avoid further involvement. A few minutes later, an older woman in 3B, a brunette with soft features and a kind presence, leaned over slightly and spoke in a gentle tone. "Sir, I saw what happened. If you need anything, I'd be happy to help." She offered the words with sincere warmth, her hand hovering slightly in a gesture of support. Before Grant could respond, Brian appeared suddenly, stepping between their rows like a referee breaking up a play. "Ma'am," he snapped, his tone far less friendly than before, "I'm going to need you to remain seated and not engage with other passengers during boarding. It's important for safety protocol." The woman blinked, taken aback. "I was just offering help. He didn't ask for anything." Brian stiffened, lowering his voice just enough to add pressure. "Exactly. He didn't ask. Let us handle it." His words were sharp, rehearsed, and final. The woman leaned back slowly, clearly unsettled. Across the aisle, a young couple had been watching the scene unfold. One of them whispered, "Why'd he shut her down like that?" But neither dared speak up louder. Back in the galley, Kara opened her crew panel and tapped into the internal flight log. She entered a note beside Grant's name. "Passenger in 2A appears confused during boarding. Limited verbal ability. Possible communication delay. Monitor." She stared at the screen for a second, then added, "Uncooperative with crew suggestion to assist." She clicked save. Meanwhile, Grant returned to his notepad, flipping to a fresh page. He began writing again, not a message for the crew this time, but a letter to himself. It was something he'd done for years, whenever injustice came dressed in uniforms and titles. His pen moved slowly across the paper. Same patterns. New faces. Still assuming silence means submission. He stopped, underlined it twice, and closed the notebook with care. At that moment, Olivia Stanton closed her tablet in row 4A. She had seen enough to know the crew wasn't just unprofessional. They were coordinated in their disrespect. And worse, they were emboldened. She had received Kara's message earlier. Now she'd watched it play out live. Yet still, she didn't intervene. Not yet. Timing was everything. Behind her calm expression, she drafted a formal time-stamped report on her phone, noting the exact exchange between Kara and the younger white passenger, the overreach by Brian when stopping the woman from helping, and the log entry she knew would now exist in the system, potentially flagging Grant unfairly. Olivia had learned early on from her father that real power doesn't shout. It waits, it documents, and then it moves decisively. Though the flight crew had attempted to dismiss and contain his quiet resistance, they were not finished with him. Not yet. As the aircraft taxied onto the runway, Kara stood at the front of the cabin with a forced smile, going through the safety demonstration while her voice moved on autopilot. Brian walked briskly down the aisle under the guise of checking seatbelts, but his eyes lingered on Grant. He didn't speak this time, just looked at the older man with an expression of barely concealed irritation, as though Grant's composure had somehow become the most disruptive thing on board. 15 minutes into flight, with the seatbelt sign still illuminated, Grant slowly unbuckled and rose from his seat. His movement was not hurried, not defiant. He simply needed the restroom, just as any passenger might. He reached into his coat pocket for a folded paper indicating his bladder medication, a precaution he always carried. As he stepped into the aisle, Kara materialized from the front like she'd been waiting for the opportunity. She raised her palm. "Sir, I'm going to need you to sit back down. The seatbelt sign is still on." Grant nodded once and calmly showed her the slip of paper. She didn't take it. She didn't even read it. "Sir, if you continue to ignore instructions, I'll have to notify the captain." Grant tapped the laminated restroom symbol on the wall behind her, then the medication paper again. Kara's voice dropped low enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You're becoming a security concern, Mr. Holloway." A murmur started from behind him. Someone in row 3 whispered, "Security concern?" A man in 1C leaned into the aisle, raising an eyebrow. Brian appeared once more, radio in hand. "Back to your seat, sir," he said firmly. "We've had a prior notation about non-cooperative behavior. This is your final warning." Grant slowly turned, walked back to his seat, and sat down again, the medication paper still clenched in his hand. He did not look up. He did not respond. But across the cabin, whispers now turned into sideways glances, the kind that multiplied and mutated into assumptions. Moments later, the PA crackled. The voice of the captain broke through the quiet hum of the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to remind all passengers that any disruptive or uncooperative behavior will not be tolerated on this flight. If you observe something concerning, please notify a flight attendant immediately." His tone was even, his message seemingly general, but his timing was surgical. Every eye in first class turned to Grant Holloway. Some stared openly, others tried to hide it behind magazines or phone screens. The woman in 3B, who had once offered kindness, now looked away. The tech bro across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. The socialite behind Grant let out a dramatic sigh. Grant exhaled slowly. He knew what this was. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't about safety. It was performance. The airline wasn't just enforcing rules. It was establishing dominance. His quiet refusal to yield had triggered a system trained to stamp out anything that didn't comply on command. Beside him, the in-flight screen looped an animation of smiling passengers securing oxygen masks. It was ironic, really, because the air around him had grown so thin. Back in row 4A, Olivia Stanton clenched her jaw. She had remained silent up to this point, allowing her internal protocol to run its course. But now, watching a veteran, because she had recognized him earlier, long before anyone else, be painted as a threat over a bathroom break, something inside her began to shift. She opened her tablet and started a formal complaint report. Not a passive note, not an email draft, but a document labeled "In-Flight Discrimination and Abuse of Power, Preliminary Record." She time-stamped the moment the captain's voice came over the speaker, logged the denied restroom access, and typed a single sentence in bold. Passenger profiled and publicly targeted under the guise of security protocol. Meanwhile, Kara and Brian stood together near the galley, voices low but intense. "If he tries anything again," Kara said, "we escalate." Brian nodded. Captain already flagged him. They shared a glance of grim satisfaction, as if believing their control was absolute, as if forgetting planes land, and what happens in the sky doesn't stay there. Passengers now glanced at Grant not with curiosity, but with suspicion, an elderly man, once invisible, now branded as disruptive without uttering a word. From the front of the cabin, a man in a dark gray vest and a lanyard that read Flight Operations Supervisor stepped through the curtain with the urgency of someone called in to clean up a public mess. His name was Wallace Trent, and his job wasn't to ask questions. It was to protect the airline's interest, no matter the moral cost. Kara met him near the galley, her voice low but pressed with conviction. He stood up while the seatbelt sign was on. Then, when I asked him to return, he didn't respond immediately. Brian flagged it. Captain backed it. Wallace nodded mechanically, already pulling out his tablet. Good. I'll mark him as non-compliant. Document it now. We may need to justify pre-landing security intervention if this escalates. He scrolled through a standardized incident form and tapped in notes without ever having spoken to the man in question. Deaf, black, elderly. This could go PR bad real quick. We need everything airtight, he muttered. Kara didn't blink. She had done this before. Just a few rows behind them, a passenger named Eliza Moreno had been quietly recording the earlier confrontation on her phone. A tech entrepreneur in her early 30s, she wasn't new to corporate dynamics, and she'd seen enough tone-deaf authority to know when someone was being silenced. Her camera, angled discreetly from her lap, had captured Grant being denied the restroom. The condescending tone of Kara, the way Brian hovered like a warden. Eliza wasn't filming for drama. She was filming for truth. But as she continued, a new figure appeared in the aisle, a plainclothes man mid-40s, with an earpiece and an expression carved from concrete. He moved like he didn't belong in customer service, because he didn't. His name tag identified him only as L. Morgan, Cabin Safety Specialist. He stopped next to Eliza's row and leaned in. Ma'am, he said quietly but firmly, recording crew or passengers without consent is a violation of federal privacy law. I'll need you to put the phone away immediately. Eliza didn't flinch. This is public safety. I'm not live streaming. I'm documenting. Morgan's voice hardened. Doesn't matter. We've had issues with footage being edited and misrepresented. If you don't stop, I'll have to escalate. The word escalate hung heavy, more threat than warning. She sighed, pressed stop, and locked her phone, but her eyes stayed sharp. She knew the truth. What they couldn't suppress physically, they'd suppress legally. Meanwhile, back in 2A, Grant stared ahead, unmoving, unaware of the camera, the earpiece, the form being filled in his name. But he felt it, felt the way the system had turned inward, forming layers of protocol not to protect passengers, but to protect itself from accountability. The longer he sat, the more he realized. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Olivia Stanton had witnessed everything from row 4A. She saw Wallace's arrival, Kara's quick narrative, and Morgan's surgical silencing of the woman filming behind her. She also noticed something no one else did. The way Brian typed something into the crew's shared tablet interface, paused, then deleted a line and replaced it with a cleaner version. Olivia took out her tablet again, opening the secure compliance app reserved for internal investigations. She screen captured the flight log update in real time. The entry read, Passenger 2A failed to comply with safety protocols. Declined verbal instructions multiple times. Monitored. Olivia added her own annotation beneath it. No attempt made to provide accommodations for hearing-impaired passenger. Initial request dismissed without review. She had spent years investigating misconduct across every airline under the company's umbrella. But this was the first time she'd sat in the middle of it while it unfolded in real time. In the rear galley, Wallace continued typing with precision. Note to Captain, he dictated quietly. Passenger may pose a risk during descent. Requesting early clearance for law enforcement standby at gate. He didn't say arrest. He didn't have to. Words like observe, monitor, and prepare were the corporate code for preemptive containment. Brian checked the coffee service, his tone breezy, like nothing was wrong. Kara walked the aisle again, pausing once to offer the socialite in 3C a glass of wine. Apologies for the earlier disruption, she said smoothly. We're doing everything to keep things calm and pleasant up here. The woman raised her glass with a knowing look. Good. First class isn't the place for that kind of energy. Kara smiled and nodded. She agreed. At least, until someone like that bought a ticket. Grant Holloway sat still in 2A, surrounded by silence that wasn't his own, but carefully manufactured. He was now no longer just a passenger. He had become a problem, a label, a pre-written entry in a log filled out before truth had a chance to speak. Wallace, the onboard supervisor, emerged from the galley once again, this time not with a device in hand, but with purpose in his stride. Behind him, Brian followed with clipped steps, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding contact. Olivia Stanton remained in 4A, watching without blinking as Wallace stopped at Grant's seat and lowered his voice just enough for the cabin to sense that something was happening, but not enough to hear exactly what was being said. "Mr. Holloway," Wallace began, tone calm but cold, "for the continued comfort and safety of our other passengers, we're going to reassign your seat to a quieter location in the cabin." Grant turned his head slowly, looked the man directly in the eye, and pulled out his notepad with deliberate precision. In sharp handwriting, he wrote, "What does quieter location mean?" Wallace barely looked at the note before replying, "There's been too much disruption in this section. This is for your own benefit as well as ours." Before Grant could respond, Kara appeared beside Wallace, holding a folded paper. "We've arranged for seat 31D, she said, her voice taking on a falsely helpful edge. "It's a little more isolated, more room for peace and quiet." Grant didn't move. Not immediately. Not until Wallace shifted his stance subtly, an inch closer. A gesture that wasn't physical force, but one that made it clear refusal would lead to escalation. Grant stood, adjusted his coat, and with his notepad tucked beneath his arm, walked the length of the plane past rows of eyes, trying not to watch and failing. He did not look left or right. He kept his posture straight, not because he was proud, but because he refused to give them the image of defeat. Row 31D was tucked against the rear lavatory wall, where the air smelled of antiseptic and recycled moisture. The seat was narrower, more rigid, and the overhead bins had long since been filled by coach passengers. Grant had no space for his belongings. He sat without complaint, but the ache in his spine was immediate and undeniable. He placed his notepad on the tray table and stared at it for a moment, unmoving, before flipping to a blank page and writing, "Moved without cause. Denied dignity. Still watching." Back in first class, Olivia noted the time and typed into her tablet. "Passenger forcibly relocated to non-equivalent seat, despite no threat or verbal disruption. No medical justification provided. Comfort used as euphemism for containment." Then she took a breath, deep and tight, her fingers curling slightly against the edge of her armrest. She had given the crew every chance to correct themselves. They had chosen escalation instead. Meal service began shortly after. Carts wheeled down the aisle, with smiling attendants offering warm bread, wine, and white cloth napkins. Kara passed through first class with her best performance yet, handing out grilled salmon and filet medallions as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Brian followed with drinks. Further back, a different attendant reached row 31, scanning the printed list clipped to her tray. She paused in front of Grant's seat, then leaned slightly over the cart. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her tone blank. "Your meal was marked as a special dietary request. Unfortunately, that order wasn't confirmed in our system, so we don't have anything available for you at this time." Grant raised an eyebrow, picked up his notepad, and wrote, "I didn't request a special meal." The attendant shrugged, offering a forced apology, before moving on without another word. No food, no explanation, no attempt to rectify the mistake. In row 30, a teenage girl leaned toward her mother, whispering, "Why didn't they give him a meal?" Her mother, silent for a moment, replied, "Because some people think silence means weakness." Grant heard none of it, but his stillness spoke volumes. At the front of the plane, Wallace returned to the galley, speaking quietly into a handheld radio. "Passenger 2A has been moved. Logged as resolved. Prepare gate team to meet on landing." Brian, standing nearby, offered a tight nod. Kara was already compiling a follow-up entry for the flight report, her words sanitized and free of detail. Passenger voluntarily accepted alternate seating after crew advised for comfort and compliance. No further disruptions observed. But Olivia Stanton had already copied the previous log entry, screenshotted Kara's draft, and opened her private folder labeled Discrimination Escalation Verified. She wasn't just watching now, she was documenting for impact. She took a long look around the cabin, noting the complicit expressions, the polite indifference, the thin smiles of those who had accepted a lie because it made their seat more comfortable. At the back of the aircraft, Grant closed his eyes. He had been many things in his life: pilot, father, veteran, whistleblower, but never invisible. And yet, in this moment, the system had tried to reduce him to nothing. They had moved him like baggage, denied him like an oversight. But he knew something they didn't. The more they tried to erase him, the louder his return would be. The fluorescent light above him buzzed faintly, casting an artificial glare across his silver hair and weathered features. Behind him, the lavatory door clicked open and shut with regular interruptions, and each time it did, a gust of sterilized air blew against his ankles. Still, he did not flinch. He did not complain. He simply endured. 2 rows forward, Brian leaned against the bulkhead divider near the galley, scrolling casually through his in-flight interface while sipping orange juice from a plastic cup. Kara stood beside him, arms crossed, whispering just under the hum of the engine. "You see him when he tried to scribble something again?" she said, her voice edged with sarcasm. "Looked like Morse code with arthritis." Brian smirked but didn't respond. Kara, emboldened by his silence, lifted her hands in an exaggerated pantomime of Grant's earlier signing. Clumsy, mocking gestures meant more to amuse than resemble anything intelligible. "I'm very important," she mimicked with a fake solemn face, then shook her hands dramatically. "I'm old and misunderstood." She giggled softly. Brian chuckled under his breath and gave a slow, sarcastic clap. "Oscar-worthy," he muttered, then turned away as if it were just harmless fun. Neither of them noticed the teenage girl 2 rows behind them who had caught every movement, and whose phone was still quietly recording from a half-zip backpack. Back in seat 31D, Grant reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn wallet, the leather edges frayed but intact. From within it, he withdrew a small, laminated photo, one of the few things he always carried with him. The image, faded from years of travel, showed a much younger version of himself in a flight captain's uniform, standing between a woman and 2 children, all smiling beneath the shadow of a propeller jet. As he adjusted the photo on his tray table, a sharp jolt from turbulence rattled the cabin. The laminated picture slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor, landing just behind his seat near where Kara was inspecting the beverage cart. She noticed it first and bent down to pick it up. "What's this?" she muttered, examining the image. Her lips twisted into a smirk. "Ah, look who we've got here. Grandpa Flyboy." She turned to Brian and waved the photo. "Think this fell out of someone else's wallet?" Brian looked over briefly. Maybe he picked it up off the seat. Old folks misplace things all the time. Kara nodded with mock sympathy. Maybe he thinks it's his. Sad. With that, she casually placed the photo on the edge of the service counter like it was an unclaimed charger cable, then turned back to reloading the drink tray. Grant, unable to hear the exchange, stood slowly and looked around, scanning the aisle and floor for the photo. When he spotted it sitting near the galley counter, he took 1 step forward, then hesitated as Kara walked past him without a glance. He retrieved the photo himself, returning it gently to his wallet without expression. His movements were deliberate, careful, and filled with the weight of memory. He didn't scowl. He didn't write. He just sat back down, refolded his coat, and resumed his silence. Olivia Stanton had been watching everything. Though her seat was now 2 cabins away, she had switched to the crew channel minutes ago through a privileged interface not available to regular passengers. The internal system allowed her to observe flagged behavioral logs in real time. She had already seen 3 different entries, now logged under Grant's passenger ID, each one more vague and damning than the last. Her brows tightened as she read the most recent one, submitted by Kara. Passenger appears increasingly disoriented. Dropped personal items. Failed to acknowledge crew presence when spoken to. Possible early signs of confusion or agitation. Olivia's jaw clenched. She began typing rapidly into her tablet's compliance system. No observed signs of agitation. Passenger ignored, mocked, and displaced without justification. Crew engaged in unprofessional commentary and gesture-based harassment. Incident ongoing. Near the exit row, the teenage girl who had been recording earlier tapped her mother's arm. "Should we show someone?" she whispered. Her mother glanced nervously toward the back of the plane, where Kara and Brian were now laughing quietly while restocking snack trays. "Not yet," she whispered back. "Let's keep the video. Just in case." Grant Holloway, seated in 31D near the humming lavatory door, had returned to stillness, not because he was at peace, but because he had been forged in places colder than this. Across the aisle, Kara and Brian stood shoulder to shoulder, their laughter now fading into a low murmur as the snack service concluded and the cabin settled into a strange rhythm of artificial normalcy. Most passengers had returned to their reading, their shows, their drinks, but a few still cast the occasional glance back toward Grant, half curious, half conditioned by the earlier announcements to see him as other. For rows forward in Economy Plus, Olivia Stanton sat still, her posture composed, but her expression now unreadable. She had seen enough. She had logged every word, gesture, and false entry. She had watched the slow, calculated stripping of a man's dignity under the banner of procedure. And now it had crossed a threshold. When Kara leaned over to Brian once more and whispered, just loud enough for Olivia to hear, "Can't wait till this lands. He's probably going to file some dramatic complaint." They always do. Olivia closed her tablet. Not with frustration, with finality. She rose quietly from her seat, stepped into the aisle, and walked back toward the rear of the plane with calm, steady strides. Passengers along the way looked up, sensing a shift in atmosphere. Some registering her sharp navy blazer and calm authority. Others just curious at the rare sight of a woman walking forward against the direction of judgment. When Olivia reached the galley near Grant's row, Kara turned instinctively, flashing a rehearsed smile. "Ma'am, I'm afraid passengers aren't allowed to stand." Olivia lifted one hand, gently but firmly. "You may want to pause that thought," she said, her voice level, controlled, and razor-sharp. Then, she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and produced a laminated ID badge with a silver trim. The name glinted under the cabin lights. Olivia Stanton, Executive Director, Equity and Compliance, Ridgepoint Aviation Holdings. Brian blinked first. Kara's smile froze in place, her voice failing to surface. "I suggest," Olivia continued, still calm, "you both take a moment to reflect on what you've documented in the in-flight incident log. Because I've been reviewing those entries live from seat 17A. Every one of them." Kara swallowed. Brian stepped back slightly. Wallace, who had been half-seated near the jump seat, stood up fast, his clipboard still in hand. "Miss Stanton," he started, his voice suddenly soft. "I wasn't aware. I'm sure you weren't," Olivia said flatly. "But that doesn't change what I've witnessed, nor what I've captured. I've observed the systematic mistreatment of a paying passenger, including mockery, false documentation, targeted displacement, and the obstruction of witness evidence under the guise of privacy policy. And to be clear, the man you've been treating like a threat is Grant Holloway." Wallace's eyes twitched. "Ma'am, is that name supposed to mean something?" Olivia's tone didn't change. "It should. Mr. Holloway is a decorated veteran, a retired Federal Aviation Safety Director. And, until he walked onto this plane, a private consultant with direct ties to our audit board. In fact, he helped write the very safety policies you just used to humiliate him." Dead silence. Kara's face drained of color. Brian stepped back further, now visibly rattled. Olivia turned to face the rest of the passengers, her voice just loud enough to carry without yelling. "For those of you wondering, yes, this is as bad as it looks. Worse, in fact. What you've witnessed isn't an isolated incident. It's a mirror of how systems protect themselves through silence, manipulation, and coded bias." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the cabin walls. "This stops now." Then, Olivia knelt slightly beside Grant's seat. Her eyes softened. "Mr. Holloway," she said gently, "my name is Olivia Stanton. I work for the airline's parent company, and I'm deeply sorry for what's happened to you today. I'm going to make this right." Grant looked at her, expression unchanged, but there was something in his eyes, an old recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that she wasn't speaking from pity. She was speaking from position. She offered her hand. He took it. The entire back half of the cabin seemed to exhale at once. Wallace cleared his throat weakly. "Miss Stanton, what do you want us to?" "Sit down," Olivia said without turning. "All of you." Kara stood frozen near the service cart, her arms stiff at her sides, her eyes darting from Olivia to Wallace, to the passengers, now hanging on every word. Brian's jaw clenched, but his voice had gone dry in his throat. Wallace, normally composed in the face of any customer dispute, now looked like a man realizing the plane he was piloting had just lost both engines. Olivia didn't look at them anymore. She turned her focus fully to Grant, still seated in 31D, composed yet alert, his hand now resting gently atop the folded photo of his family on the tray table. With her left hand, Olivia pulled her phone from her blazer pocket and unlocked it with a single press. She pressed one contact at the top of her screen. It read Dad CEO. The phone rang only once before a voice answered on the other end, brisk and deep with the kind of command that never needed to raise its tone. "Olivia, I'm in the middle of a Zurich brief, Dad," she interrupted, her voice low and tightly measured. "I need you to stop what you're doing, right now." The pause on the other end was immediate and absolute. What happened? She turned her back slightly, stepped further into the aisle, and continued without missing a beat. "I'm currently in flight. Your airline, your crew, and they've spent the last 2 hours humiliating a man named Grant Holloway." Another pause. "As in the Grant Holloway?" Olivia's voice did not waver. "Yes. He booked a first-class ticket. They bumped him, mocked him, removed him, falsely logged him as a threat. And just now, they laughed at him dropping a photo of his wife." The voice on the line sharpened. "Where is he now?" Olivia replied instantly. "Seat 31D. I've documented everything. I want a full review team waiting at the gate when we land. Internal affairs, compliance, HR, legal, everyone. No NDAs, no protective memos. I want clean eyes and clean hands." The voice answered quickly. "Done. Is he safe?" "He's calm," she said, turning back to Grant. "But this was more than just a mistake. This was a systemic failure, and the airline still owes him more than back pay." She ended the call without ceremony and slid the phone back into her pocket. Then, she turned to face the cabin. Her voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in weight. "Some of you may not know the name Grant Holloway, but you should. He's not just a passenger. He's the former vice president of aviation safety for this very company, Ridgepoint Holdings. He dedicated 30 years to making sure planes like this one didn't fall from the sky. And when he discovered internal corruption in maintenance protocols, yes, that includes falsified engine inspections, he submitted the findings directly to the board." She paused, scanning the passengers. Not a single pair of eyes blinked. "And how did the company thank him?" she continued. "They forced him into early retirement under the guise of restructuring, silenced him, buried his contributions." Her voice lowered, but somehow it carried farther. "And now, years later, your crew treated him like a risk, not a resource, like a problem to be moved, like a memory to erase." Eliza Moreno, the tech entrepreneur who had recorded earlier, slowly lifted her phone again and began filming. Not secretly this time. Several other passengers followed suit. A man in a suit near the front whispered, "Oh my God, I've read his papers. He's the reason some of these safety standards even exist." Olivia nodded toward him. "Exactly. And if the public knew what happened to him today, they'd start asking what else we're covering up at 35,000 feet. She looked back toward Kara and Brian. "You didn't just mishandle a customer. You mishandled the cornerstone of your own house." The energy shifted permanently. No one laughed anymore, no one whispered about first-class standards, and no one dared meet Grant Holloway's eyes unless it was with respect. Even the most indifferent travelers now sat straighter in their seats, caught in the undeniable gravity of what had just unfolded. The flight crew avoided eye contact completely. Kara moved robotically through the motions of post-service cleanup, no longer speaking to Brian, who had retreated into the galley with Wallace, their voices hushed, their faces drawn tight with panic beneath the plastic professionalism they tried desperately to maintain. Olivia didn't say another word. She didn't have to. Her message had been delivered with the sharp clarity of truth wrapped in authority. She tapped one last command into her tablet, syncing the in-flight security AI device embedded inside her travel case, a discreet black Samsonite carry-on that contained a biometric-enhanced module capable of silently recording encrypted footage and capturing behavior-based emotional markers from within a 20-foot radius. The device, part of a pilot compliance tool for internal investigation audits, had been running the entire flight. Every gesture, every word, every smirk, every silence, all logged and time-stamped. 10 minutes before landing, Olivia transmitted the entire flight segment to Ridgepoint Aviation's legal compliance server via satellite link, flagged high priority. The transmission included her annotations, footage from 3 angles, audio transcriptions, and AI-coded indicators of bias, negligence, and false reporting. The packet was received and opened at headquarters before the aircraft had even begun its descent. As the seatbelt sign chimed on and the cabin tilted slightly toward the tarmac, Wallace finally broke from his frozen panic and approached Olivia's row. He spoke quietly, carefully. "Miss Stanton, I understand we've made some serious misjudgments today. I'd like to offer my personal apology to Mr. Holloway and save it," Olivia said, her tone cold but measured. "You'll have your chance to answer to someone with more authority than me in about 5 minutes." Wallace's lips pressed into a thin line, and he returned to the galley, where Kara stood white-faced, chewing her lip. "They're going to eat us alive," she whispered. Brian didn't respond. He was staring blankly at the wall. As the wheels touched the runway with a sharp jolt and the reverse thrusters roared, the cabin let out a collective breath. A woman 2 rows ahead of Olivia clasped her hands in her lap, whispering to her seatmate, "I've never seen anyone do what she just did, not on a plane, not ever." The man beside her nodded solemnly. That wasn't a passenger. That was a reckoning. The plane rolled to a stop at Gate 17, and as the ding of arrival echoed overhead, passengers instinctively reached for their seatbelts. But before anyone could rise, a crisp voice came over the intercom, not from a cockpit, but from an external channel patched in. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is airport security. We kindly ask all passengers to remain seated for a moment. Cabin crew, please remain at your stations." There was no mistaking the tone. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Through the oval window, several passengers spotted them first. 2 uniformed officers, flanked by 3 plainclothes agents in navy blazers marked with the Ridgepoint crest. They waited at the jet bridge like statues. Within moments, the front door opened. Wallace moved first, stepping toward the entry with a thin smile plastered on his face, ready to spin damage control. "Afternoon, officers. Can I help you?" Wallace Trent, one of the agents, interrupted. "Step aside. We need to speak with you and your 2 senior crew members." Now, Kara paled visibly as her name was called next, followed by Brian's. The 3 were escorted down the jet bridge in full view of the passengers. No cuffs, no yelling. But everyone understood the message. It was rare to see accountability happen in real time. Grant watched them go, without expression. Olivia, standing a few feet behind, simply opened her case, removed the AI module, and handed it to the lead investigator without a word. The agent nodded respectfully and accepted the device. "We received the file. It's already been backed up and forwarded to legal." As passengers began to deplane, one by one, they passed Grant's seat with brief nods, quiet apologies, or the kind of respectful acknowledgement rarely offered to strangers. Some stopped to shake his hand. Others said nothing but met his eyes. When Eliza Moreno reached him, she offered her phone with the video file queued. "I've got a copy," she said. "You'll have everything you need." Grant simply nodded. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself a small smile. Weeks had passed since Flight 227 touched down and left behind more than just tire marks on the tarmac. It left a scar across the airline's public image, a rift inside its operations, and for 3 crew members, a reckoning that none of them saw coming. Internal investigations moved quickly and thoroughly. The AI logs, passenger statements, and the unfiltered footage from Olivia's case had rendered denials useless. Kara and Brian were both suspended indefinitely pending formal hearings, and Wallace was quietly removed from his position under the title organizational restructuring, though insiders knew exactly what that meant. But not every consequence was disciplinary. Some were deeply human. Kara Jensen had not spoken publicly since the incident. Her inbox was flooded with reprimands, her social media silenced under the weight of thousands of comments, many condemning, some forgiving, others curious. What were you thinking? Yet none of them stung as much as what she saw replayed in her own mind. Grant's face when she sprayed his coat, his silence when she mocked his signing, the small photo she joked about as if it meant nothing. She had replayed the flight not just from the video footage, but from the aching clarity of regret. And so, one rainy Tuesday morning, she took a leave of absence, boarded a quiet commuter train to Richmond, and walked the final 2 blocks to a modest eldercare home tucked behind a row of trees. At the front desk, she asked gently, "Is Mr. Grant Holloway here today?" The nurse, older and kind-eyed, gave her a curious look. "Yes, he's in the garden. He likes the quiet." Kara thanked her, walked slowly down the hallway, and pushed open the back door. There, sitting beneath a gray sky with a blanket across his lap, was the man she had once ridiculed without knowing who he was, yet fully knowing that she shouldn't have treated anyone the way she did. Grant didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his eyes locked onto hers with a calm that unnerved her more than anger ever could. Kara stepped forward, swallowed the lump in her throat, and spoke through a voice cracking with restraint. "Mr. Holloway, I came to say I'm sorry for everything." Grant said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. She continued, "That day on the plane, I thought I was doing my job. I thought following protocol meant I was right. But I wasn't. I wasn't even close." Her voice trembled now. "You didn't deserve any of it. And I didn't just fail you. I failed what I thought I stood for." Grant studied her for a long moment, then slowly reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out his notepad. He flipped to a fresh page, wrote 4 words, and held it up. "Learning is not failure." Kara's eyes welled. She dropped to sit on the bench beside him, no longer flight crew, no longer superior, just a person facing the weight of her mistake. That moment didn't make headlines, didn't trend, didn't go viral. But it mattered. It marked the beginning of something deeper than punishment: transformation. Meanwhile, halfway across the country, Ridgepoint Aviation announced the launch of a new program titled Skyline Respect Initiative, co-founded by Olivia Stanton and Grant Holloway. The mission was bold and unapologetic: to overhaul airline treatment of elderly, disabled, and vulnerable passengers, to train crew members not only in regulation, but in dignity, and to ensure that stories like Grant's would never repeat under the protection of silence again. The initiative was backed by a fund seeded by the airline's board, not as hush money, but as acknowledgement. Grant declined a settlement. Instead, he requested that the money be directed toward travel assistance programs for seniors with hearing loss and veterans with mobility impairments. He gave only one interview, a brief appearance on national news. When asked how he felt about what happened on that flight, he replied, "I don't need an apology in the air. I need change on the ground." When the anchor asked if he forgave the people involved, he nodded and said, "Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without hating." Olivia stood beside him during that broadcast, not as a company executive, but as a daughter who had seen how power can blind people, and how it must be used when the moment comes to shine light, not cast shadow. Their partnership wasn't just symbolic. Together, they rewrote the internal flight crew code of conduct, introduced empathy-based simulation training, and developed a passenger accountability hotline that bypassed cabin crew hierarchy and reported directly to the oversight board. Grant continued to fly, not for luxury, not for business, but for presence. And every time he boarded a flight, another crew member recognized him, not because he was famous, but because the name Holloway now meant someone is watching and someone still cares. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the silent injustice or the quiet redemption? Tell us in the comments. And let us know, where in the world are you watching from?